We are continuing to move through our journey to the release of Season 3. We talked about the DPS in Mythic Plus, so now we have to talk about the tanks in Mythic Plus. What will follow will be the healers in Mythic Plus, and then we will move on to the healers, tanks, and DPS in the raid, right before the release of the season. For today though, if we were to talk about tanks, something interesting is going on in the tank role. If you were to listen to many of the highly regarded top tanks in Dragonflight, you would be hearing raving reviews about the state of tanks. You know, Death Knight looks amazing, Vengeance Demon Hunter Reworks is great, the tier set of Brewmaster is fantastic, Prot Paladin is filled with tons of utility and cooldowns to be good in all facets of the game. The situation amongst tanks seems amazing. We have talked about this when we went through Season 1 and then Season 2, and we were looking at the Mythic Plus popularity of specs, we were going through all of the roles, and we were praising tanks for being way more balanced, way more even than the rest of the roles in the game. However, as much even as they can be, we still ended up with Exodia comp dominating Season 2, with Guardian Druid making up almost 80% of all of the tank picks in high keys. So, even for all of this balance, we are still going to end up having one dominant tank at the very high keys, but it's still worth pointing out that the state of the specs in the tank role is definitely the better one across all of the roles. Some other roles are going to have some terrible specs, playing awfully, being too weak, being just not fun to play. This is not nearly the case when it comes to tanks. So if we were to put them in a tier list for Mythic Plus, we can start, for example, by removing the bottom tier of this tier list, because there are no tanks that weak that deserve to be there. However, even if we remove that bottom, then a new tier becomes the bottom, which is where we are putting Guardian Druid and where we are putting Brewmaster Monk. Now, they are here for completely different reasons. The problem of Guardian Druid was the heinous Blood Frenzy nerf they received before this patch. Blood Frenzy used to give you 2 rage per enemy hit by Thrash with 0 target cap. So you go for your Mega, Giga, 20 target pulls and you're getting 40 rage per Thrash, which is gigantic. It was nerfed to be capped at just 5 targets. So now 5 targets, 2 rage per target, it's 10. You're going from 40 to 10. It's a gigantic nerf. Blizzard tried to give it a slight bump as a buff. Now you're generating 3 rage instead of 2, but it is still capped at 5 targets, which means the moment you go above 8 targets, above 8 enemies, you will start feeling the nerf in the rage generation. This is made worse though, the state of Guardian, because you lose your very powerful tier set from Aberrus. The tier set from Aberrus not only gave you more damage and gave you 15% more max HP, which is a very good defensive tool, it also gave you basically 15% more rage generation. And the problem is that your new tier set, your Amir Drasil tier set, does not interact with your rage generation at all. Basically, going from Season 2 to Season 3, you are losing 15% rage generation, and your trash now generates significantly less rage in larger AoE packs. This has compounding domino effects of badness on the spec. You have very powerful talents like Ursoc's Guidance, which is needed to reduce the cooldown of Incarnation, which is now weaker because you generate less rage, you spend less rage, therefore you don't reduce the cooldown of Incarnation nearly as much. Another very powerful utility talent like After the Wildfire. This is also as powerful as the rage you can spend. So generating less rage makes this talent also worse. The other problem was the massive amount of cope used by Guardian Druids for the Amir Drasil tier set. Many players were hoping that the buggy and unreliable tier set in the PTR was eventually going to be fixed. The number of the absorb shield from the tier set was eventually going to be good enough, was eventually going to be strong. It's not It's not. We are about to get the release of the season, and this tier set is now significantly weaker than your previous one. So when it comes to damage, when it comes to defensiveness, when it comes to rage regen, you have been nerfed across the board. You could be saying it's deserved because Guardian was giga OP in Season 2, so they needed to be brought down. However, the level to which they have been brought down right now is too weak to see them compete for the higher spots, the higher levels in Mythic Plus especially. Brewmaster, as I said, it's here for a different reason. Brewmaster is here because even though their tier set remains one of the strongest tier sets we can have across tanks, they still have the number one main problem that they are the tank which receives and takes the most amount of damage. They require the most external help out of any other tank. This is not a problem for long periods of Mythic Plus keys and low enough level keys when your own self-healing massively boosted by your tier set and massively boosted by the buffs to things like Celestial Brew or your healing expel harm, but eventually you will be reaching a point of keys high enough where this type of self-sustain won't be enough anymore. Either you have to be a Blood Death Knight, you need to have Blood Death Knight level of self-healing at certain key levels, or you need ways to mitigate more damage. Right now, Brewmaster Monk still has its only way of mitigating most of the damage being just stagger it over time, which in the end still requires you to heal somewhat, and remains a problem when you go very high in key levels. So it is still, as pointed out, a very solid tank. It still has the shockingly highest damage in Mythic Plus when it comes to AoE for a tank, but it remains with the base problem of their damage taken. The amount of damage taken they will be having to deal with in very high keys. That's why if we're talking about weekly keys, about keys at the start of the season to start pushing early on, Brewmaster might as well be S tier. But eventually, as you get more item level, you start trying to push to the very higher keys, higher and higher. Brewmaster will start reaching a gap, a ceiling, which other tanks can go past with their toolkit, while Brewmaster cannot. Then we move over to the next batch of tanks, which include Protection Paladin as well as Protection Warrior. So the Protection Bros are in the B tier, in the third tier of tanks. Now, they are actually, unlike the ones down below, they are here for similar reasons. The tier set of Protection Warrior, for starters, is very, very powerful, not just in terms of defensiveness because of the damage reduction. The 10% damage reduction when you unleash the two-piece which shields them, plus 2% more damage reduction per every bleed you are consuming, which can go quite high in terms of damage reduction. It's also helped by the damage increase, the extra damage you can do, getting a almost 30-second cooldown reduction on your Thunderous Roar, more single target damage as well to the tank. This has been all quite nice for Protection Warrior compared to their previous iteration of the spec. Protection, as usual, remains the tank in general which takes the least amount of damage, the tank that has the biggest amount of mitigation, the biggest amount of damage prevention out of all tanks, including, of course, cheese mechanics like Spell Reflection, helping a lot this type of tank. This time around, they are also helped by simply having even more damage and a pretty powerful tier set to go along with it. They are still a warrior, so they still have problems, for example, dealing with the newer affixes like Incorporeal and Afflicted. They still don't deal too well with anything that cannot be blocked or can be reflected. This is a problem that remains for Protection Warrior, but they are a very solid tank without too many weaknesses. At this point in this tier list, we reach the level where you really have everything you want as a spec. It's just that some other specs have more. It's just that they do things better. There is nothing particularly wrong with you, it's just that others are doing things a little bit better. The case for Protection Paladin is somewhat similar, although not directly coming from the tier set, because the tier set of Prot, it's for starters going to annoy some players, the fact that you now have to play around your little sandbox, having to stay inside this children's pen even more than before, staying inside Consecration now that your tier set is going to empower the cast of your consecration. Many of your other powers have remained the same as before, but there is a problem. Your powers of before are the same powers that have been nerfed 4, 5, 6, 7 times since your rework. Many of the things that Prot Paladin used to have, like very high uptime on Sentinel, almost permanent uptime on Ardent Defender, the plenty usefulness of all of their different cooldowns from Eye of Tyr to Sentinel to Ardent Defender, being able to cycle them around, Divine Toll as well, all of these were nerfed over time. Now, the uptime of Sentinel was nerfed, the uptime of Ardent Defender was nerfed, your damage across the board was nerfed by quite a lot. Paladin started, for example, Season 2 as the highest damage dealer, together with Brewmaster, as usual, and then over time, after the nerfs, actually ended up being one of the lowest damage dealing tanks by the end of the season. And it's not that this patch, it's not that this new tier set is particularly powerful in terms of damage done for Protection Paladin, for example. So they are in a case where many of their features are still very powerful, from the utility to the off-healing, to the cheese enabled by things like bubbles, immunities, and very powerful magic damage protection as a paladin. It's just that now all of this is in a nerfed state compared to the stronger version of themselves of a few months ago. They still remain a perfectly viable tank. As we will see soon enough when it comes to the raid, they are still in pole position for being one of the stronger raid tanks because of all of this. But in Mythic Plus they suffer a little bit more compared to a few of the other specs we have left. Now, I say a few of the other specs, it's actually just 2. Number 1, it's Blood Death Knight. Blood DK, as I am a fan of repeating, is always in this state of being, at the very worst, the 3rd best tank in a patch. That's just because tank players really like playing Blood Death Knight. At any given time, you can be certain to see Blood DK's representation, Blood DK's player rate numbers being very high. Tanks just like to play Blood DK. It's so self-sufficient, it's so individualistic, you play with all of your 15 different cooldowns, you heal yourself, you ignore the healers in your party, and you do things at your own pace. It's apparently a very good playstyle for many tank players. So, this time around, they continue to be a strong tank, but even more than just being the 3rd best tank, because now they are into the top 2 position for Mythic Plus. Their tier set, to be fair, is weak. Their tier set is weaker than the previous tier set from Aberrus. Now, the best part about the tier set, even though it is weaker, is the fact that it is no longer very heavily reliant on RNG. You don't get to roll a dice on whether or not you proc Vampiric Blood, which is super powerful defensively. Now it's more straightforward. Now the uptime of this 10% damage reduction will be 70 to 80%. It's quite easy to apply with Heart Strike in AoE on enemies. There are problems though with this tier set. The problem is that Heart Strike is capped. You don't get to immediately apply this tier set on 20 different enemies if you're pulling all of them. It's going to be quite slow to spread this damage reduction debuff. Number 2, the problem is of course that this is a debuff you have to put on enemies. Unlike, for example, the damage reduction buff on yourself that Protection Warrior gains. The DR, the damage reduction bonuses of a prot, are on themselves, always active, while the ones on a DK needs to be applied on an enemy, which is not always the best thing you want to do. This is a problem, for example, Vengeance has had for a long time with their style of debuffing enemies. This tier set is the same for Blood. It also has the problem that 10% damage reduction is quite low, it's quite small. The biggest problem when it came to becoming very, very meta at the very high level for Blood was similar to Brewmaster. Brewmaster has a problem where you reach high enough key levels where your self-healing is no longer high enough and you need too much help from your healer in your party to sustain the damage you're taking in the key, and it makes it hard for you to run such high key levels. The problem for Death Knight was not getting one-shot in those levels. The problem of Death Knight is that everything is fine as long as you're taking 99% of your HP in damage, because 1 second later you can heal to full. Problem is, your mitigation, your damage reduction, your ways of preventing the damage taken before it even comes is very low. Which means eventually you are reaching a certain key level where you start getting one-shot, where all of the power of your spec, which is in healing the damage taken, suddenly becomes useless because you are taking too much damage. You don't have the time, you don't have the physical time to heal yourself back up. That has always been the biggest problem of Death Knight, which has prevented it from becoming the absolute most meta of all tanks, and why I say it's constantly the third or second best tank. That is also why, for example, at the end of Shadowlands, Blood Death Knight was the best tank, was the meta tank for the last 2 seasons. Why? Because the tier set at the end of Shadowlands was the one that gave you near permanent uptime of Dancing Rune Weapon with a near permanent very high parry chance, being able to prevent lots of damage taken. That was what allowed you, one of the things that allowed you to be able to tank high keys so effectively. This tier set with just a 10% damage reduction, conditional, not on all enemies because you are target capped on Hurt Strike, it's only gonna be on all enemies if you're using A-Bomb Limb, which has a long cooldown, so it's basically not enough of a damage reduction to expect Blood Death Knight to not run in the same issues they have run in before, which is at certain key levels, they will reach a ceiling where the damage taken without strong mitigation will simply be too high for them to be able to heal back up consistently. That's the main issue they have right now. That being said though, the rest of the kit is still great. For most of the keys, for 99% of the player base, they will still be very powerful. Their damage, over the last few months, their damage has been constantly buffed over and over and over. This tier set will be no exception. The 10% damage reduction on enemies will also come with a 20% damage buff on yourself as well to those enemies. The Guardians, the Pets and Guardians for Death Knights were buffed by 30%, so your Dancing Rune Weapon is also a Guardian, so it's also buffed in damage. Your damage has gone up a lot as well. So keeping all of the powerful things you had before, like multiple cooldowns, like cheese mechanics, like anti-magic shield, being able to stop many dangerous abilities, Death Grip being even more powerful this season because of the higher number of must interrupt casts now in this season of Mythic Plus, making it very valuable. So even if the tier set doesn't really lend to being perhaps one of the highest key pushers in the season because of the too high damage taken you will be having to face, it is still one of the better specs when it comes to tanks in Season 3. It is only beaten by one, it is only beaten by Vengeance. Lo and behold, what a surprise, a reworked spec becomes OP. We are now, what, 6 for 6, 7 for 7, this expansion when it comes to this for Blizzard. So Vengeance, very simply put, it's just doing things too well across the board on multiple features. They have received several damage buffs to Sigil of Flames, to Fracture, to Soul Cleave, to Spirit Bomb, netting almost a 20% damage increase. They have also been buffed in Metamorphosis, now with the talent to reduce the cooldown is now a 2-minute cooldown instead of a 3-minute cooldown, as well as Fell Devastation now being a 40-second cooldown instead of a 1-minute cooldown, plus increased damage on the ability. Plenty of other buffs like extending the base duration of your Sigil of Flame, the base duration of Fiery Brand, the spread rate through Burning Alive, the spread rate of Fiery Brand, because now it ticks faster. It does the same damage as before, but it ticks faster, meaning you can spread it to multiple enemies faster, which is very good for Vengeance when you start a pull in Mythic Plus. On top of that, the target cap, the amount of targets it could spread to the talent Burning Alive, has been removed as well, so it can continue to spread on multiple enemies throughout the Mythic Plus pack. You have the extremely powerful, perhaps one of the strongest bits for your kit in Mythic Plus, which is Illuminated Sigils, i.e. second charge on your sigils, like for example Silence Sigils, Fear Sigils, Change Sigils even. All of this is just great for utility, for mob control, for crowd control and reducing the damage before it even comes out, because you are stopping the enemies before they even get to cast their spells. That's not all. Thanks to the double sigil, thanks to the extended duration of Sigil of Flame, now your tier set synergizing and working off of Sigil of Flame is extremely powerful. Because Sigil of Flame giving you more damage and more healing, increased by 2% on top of your stamina, increased by 2%. TLDR, you do 10% more damage, 10% more healing, and have 10% more stamina. This is already a very powerful 2-piece set bonus for your tank, is then further empowered by the 4-piece set bonus, where Sigil of Flame damage has a chance to do more damage but also give you more defensiveness because you're going to be shattering soul fragments when the effect procs. On top of that, the more fury you spend, the more cooldown reduction you gain to the spell. This gives you an almost permanent duration of Sigil of Flame throughout basically any part of your combat in Mythic Plus, which then finishes the OP part of Illuminated Sigils by giving you 20% more parry chance when Sigil of Flame is active. And since Sigil of Flame will be active almost always, that's an almost always extra 20% parry chance, which is even less damage taken, even more damage prevented, something, for example, a Blood Decay would love to prevent damage taken to begin with, which is something that Vengeance will have in this season. So this rework has given them plenty of buffs in terms of utility, defensiveness and damage, even things in their general tree like Darkness being significantly buffed in Mythic Plus. It was nerfed in the raid because now it's only a 15% chance to avoid an attack in the raid, but in Mythic Plus it becomes a 30% chance to avoid an attack, any attack taken by your party, so it becomes very powerful in Mythic Plus. All of this combined is making Vengeance the overall strongest tank in Mythic Plus. If we had to go for one complaint about the spec, is that being a spec with the magical damage debuff in the party, Chaos Brand, 5% more magical damage, it's unlucky that perhaps your party will be made up mostly by melee specs, by Outlaw, perhaps Havoc Demon Hunter, and not proper magical damage dealing specs like Mages or Warlocks, for example, to take advantage of this debuff. And that's the worst thing we can say about Vengeance, really. There are not many other bad points about this spec right now. This is what it looks like will be the, at least initial meta of Mythic Plus. The one thing we could hope for when it comes to this tank meta is to not have Vengeance have nearly as much of an oppressive dominance as Guardian Druid had in Season 2. If instead of 80% of all the high keys are done by a Vengeance, we had 50% of all keys, and then the remaining 50 is split amongst the other tanks, that would be a much better and ideal situation when it comes to this season and to the variety and the options amongst tanks in Mythic Plus. But this is what we can at the very least speculate and predict is going to happen at the beginning of Season 3. We will see, of course, in a few weeks how much of this was correct and or how much of this was changed by Blizzard after the first few weeks of play in the season. With this being said though, we are now done on this Saturday talking about tanks. So I'm going to stop right here and leave you to the rest of your weekend. We're starting the goodbyes as usual by thanking all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and help to the growth of the channel, as well as everyone else who supports still completely for free. You can like and comment down below, for example, or even subscribe to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, why is it like slipping down this goddamn camera? How hard is it to keep it standing still?